all we ever hear from the media, from people, even celebrities, is that the Jews stole Palestinian land. It's interesting to hear that. But do people really know what they are saying? Do they know the history? Do they understand that this is a very complicated issue? Well, I highly doubt that. That's why I created this episode, to give a summary of this very complex situation. But before we will go into specific details, and I will talk about that, we need to create a solid foundation that will help us to understand the big picture of this mess. So let's jump right into it. Israel is not blessed with a friendly neighborhood. Located to Israel's southwest, we have the big country of Egypt. Then, if we turn to the east of Israel, we have the country of Jordan. Then, to the northeast of Israel, we have the big country of Syria and a small country of Lebanon to Israel's north. And when Israel was re-established again in 1948, all those countries were very unfriendly towards Israel. And with all of them, Israel at a certain point was at war. And if that wasn't enough, not only all those four countries are not friendly to Israel, but the whole neighborhood is unfriendly towards Israel. Now, in red on this map, you can see the countries that are unfriendly towards Israel. Orange is still unfriendly, but a little bit better. Then we have yellow, which is like neutral. And then we have green, which is friendly countries towards Israel. And I get it, some of you may say, how can you say that France or England are neutral, where they can clearly be seen as being very, very biased towards Israel? And I get it, it's neutral compared to the red or orange countries that are very unfriendly. So we have to kind of have a scale and a balance. And we're really comparing that to other countries. Anyway, what we can clearly see here is that Israel is this tiny country in the sea of really unfriendly countries around it. And now you can ask a question: what unites all those countries in red against Israel? And one of those answers is, of course, religion. And the reality is that North Africa, the Middle and the Near East are dominated by Islam. Israel, of course, is not Muslim, and therefore this country, this tiny country, looks like a foreign body that aggravates all the rest. But if we think about the biblical history, this isn't anything new. What do I mean? Let me explain. You remember the story of Abraham, right? Well, Abraham was not a native of the land of Canaan. He was actually, according to most scholars, from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. This is what the Bible says. And today the traditional location of Ur is in Iraq. So, according to the Bible, Abraham travels a long journey from the Middle East to the Near East, to the land of Canaan. Now, at that time, what is interesting is that the world was really governed by three important centers of power. And so you had the Egyptian Empire that controlled Canaan, you had the Hittite Empire that was fighting the Egyptian Empire, and you had what I call the Assyrian Babylonian Empire. Now, if we follow the biblical narrative, this becomes extremely interesting. You see, according to the Bible, after the flood, the race of humanity was determined by the three sons of Noah. And basically, you had three different races that were established after the flood. The descendants of Japheth, Shem, and Ham. So Abraham, as the descendant of Shem, travels from the territory of Shem to the territory of Ham. So he is a foreigner. And this is really the beginning of Israel's history. From the very beginning, they are foreigners. They are called by God for a very important mission, and they must travel to a country that God has chosen for them. Now, this situation will repeat itself several times in history, including the most modern example where Jewish people return from the exile after 2000 years. But it also happened in the past. Remember, if we read the biblical story, we have the great empire of Assyria. Assyria destroys the northern kingdom and forces its people to go into exile. The southern kingdom of Judah survives, but not for long, because soon another empire emerges, the Babylonian Empire, that first conquers the remains of the Assyrian Empire and eventually gets to Judah, destroys Jerusalem and the temple. And what is interesting is that during that time, the Jewish people are forced to return to the land from which Abraham came. So, in a way, it's a return to the starting point. It's like God is saying to the Jewish people, start over. You messed up the first time, do it again. And guess what? 70 years after the exile, they have a chance to start over. Because another empire emerges, the Persian Empire, that allows the Jewish people to return. And when that happens, a new province is created in the Persian Empire called Yehud. And Yehud borders with Samaria, which is a leftover creation of the Assyrian Empire. You see, Assyria not only deported a lot of the people of the northern kingdom of Israel, but also brought into those lands foreign people, and they started marrying local people. And that's how you have the creation of the Samaritans. So when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well, she is a descendant of those people that are a mixture of the people that lived in the northern kingdom of Israel and the people that Assyria brought into this land. By the way, if you're interested in this topic, you can travel to Samaria and see Mount Gerizim. Over there, a small community of the Samaritans still gathers and worships according to the traditions coming from that Assyrian period. Anyway, when the Jews return, they are not welcomed by the Samaritans to their homeland. On the contrary, when the Jews return to Jerusalem, they see the city in ruin. So they begin rebuilding it. They build the walls, the towers, the new houses, and of course, the temple. But the Samaritans were not happy that the Jews returned. And very often, the Jewish people were attacked and even killed by the Samaritans, who decided that they are not happy about the Jewish people returning and rebuilding Jerusalem. And if you think about it, this situation is very similar to what we had in the 20th century, where the British Empire in 1917 released the Balfour Declaration. This declaration announced that the British Empire looks with favor for the return of Jews to their homeland. In the 6th century BC, we had a similar declaration, this time by the Persian Empire, which gave permission for the Jewish people to return from exile and govern a newly formed province called Yehud. In the 20th century, we see a repetition of this situation, but on a much larger scale, from all corners of the earth, and not after 70 years, but 2000 years of exile. Now, when that happens, what is interesting is that the situation is exactly as it was in the Bible. When the Jewish people return, the people that are in the land, so in that case Arabs, are unhappy about it, and they get really angry. Now, in my last video, I extensively talked about this whole situation, so if you haven't seen that video, make sure to check it out. I am leaving a link in the description of this video below. Now, before I continue, and believe me, there is still a lot of good stuff that we need to cover, I would like to take a moment now to thank all the patrons that support the channel and me. You guys are really wonderful, and thanks to you, I can continue this work. Personally, I am very grateful for your trust and support, because this is the most stable way for me to get support. I don't have to rely on YouTube algorithms, and I can really focus on what is important and what I want to cover, and not what the algorithm wants. So if you're watching this video, I ask you kindly to consider supporting me and the channel. If you like this kind of work, that's what I'm gonna be doing. Additionally, as a paid member, you get access to videos and updates I do not publish on YouTube. So if you want to be more in touch with what I'm doing, what I'm working on, probably this is the best way to do it. Become a paid member of the channel. But if you really don't want to be a paid member and still receive good updates from my work, you can join my Telegram channel. I plan to expand this channel greatly and share more and more stuff on this channel. Why? Because Telegram doesn't censor things like YouTube. And in the future, maybe this will be the only way for me to communicate with you. We don't know what will happen with censorship, especially when the topic of Israel and even the Bible can be controversial. So right now, as far as freedom goes, this is a very good way to communicate. So you can find me. I'm putting a link to my Telegram channel at the top of this screen. Anyway, let's return to our episode. So we discussed that when the Jewish people started returning from the exile after 2000 years, the Arab people were very aggravated. And actually, they started attacking the Jewish settlements. Here you can see a map of the two Ottoman provinces. The territory that we know today as Israel in the 19th century, so when the Ottoman empires were ruling this territory, actually the territory of Israel was divided into two provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and they were called Beirut Vilayet and Mutasarrifate of Jerusalem. Those were the official names of this territory under the Ottoman Empire, and not Palestine, as some would have you believe. Anyway, during the Ottoman Empire, you had Jewish people living in the cities you can now see on this map. And the reality is that Jews were never totally removed from the Promised Land. There always was a remnant, a small amount of Jewish people living in the land, even in the most difficult times when they were exiled by the Romans. And yes, it wasn't a big community, but guess what? The Arab community living in the Promised Land under the Ottoman Empire was also not very big. During the Ottoman Empire rule, there was about 500,000 Arab people living in the Promised Land. And only after the Jews started developing the land, producing jobs, producing fruit of the land, there was a mass migration of the Arabs to the Promised Land. Here, for example, you have a graph showing you the population of Israel. So, there are 9.5 million Israelis, and in that 9.5 million you have 2 million Arabs who also have the citizenship of Israel with full rights. That's 21% of the Israelis are Arab. Not a lot of people know about this, but those are Arabs that live in Israel and have access to everything. And if we look at this graph again, you have something called Palestine. This is what people call Palestine. there isn't something like Palestine never was. Okay, but it also shows you the population of Arabs that are living in the so-called West Bank and Gaza, and that's 5 million. So from 500,000 we went up to 5 million. Tell me, where is the genocide? And if you look at this graph, the population of Israelis, so that's Jews and Arabs, and the Arabs, which are encompassed in this name, Palestine, grows in a similar way. So there is no genocide. Okay, but let's go back to the Ottoman Empire and what has happened there. So we talked that the situation of the Jewish people in the 20th century and 19th century, as you can see here, is similar to the one we saw in the Bible when they were returning from the exile, and at home there were people that didn't want them there. And the Jewish people in the 19th and 20th century received the same welcome. And remember how it says in the book of Nehemiah that when the Jews returned from the exile, they had to work with one hand holding a hammer and the other hand holding a sword. And this is something that the Jews had to again face in the 19th century when they were returning to their promised land. And at that time, there were Arab bandits that started attacking the Jewish settlements and killing many of the Jewish settlers. The Jewish people responded by fortifying the settlements, and the farmers, workers, engineers turned into fighters. Now, what is interesting is that the skills of self-defense were developed in another part of the world, the Russian Empire. You see, at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, we had a series of pogroms. And pogroms were acts of violence against the Jewish population living in the Russian Empire. So burning of houses, destruction of wealth, and killing and raping, unfortunately. And the majority of these tragic events happened in the territory you can see now in blue. This was a special settlement zone, sometimes called the Pale of Settlement, reserved especially for the Jewish people. And the Russian Empire created a special law which said basically that the Jewish people have to settle in this Pale of Settlement. And many Jewish people were deported from the Russian Empire to this settlement zone. And this territory is today's Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, and parts of Ukraine. And this resulted in an accumulation of the Jewish population on this territory, which compared to other places in the world was extremely high. Over 5 million Jews lived on those territories at the end of the 19th century. But that was not the biggest problem of the Jewish community. The biggest problem was that they started experiencing violence from the local population. So Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, all those local people started committing those pogroms on the Jewish population. And sometimes the governing powers were allowing it, and sometimes even encouraging such behavior. Anyway, some of the pogroms at the beginning of the 20th century in cities like Żytomierz, Kishinev, Homiel were really drastic, graphic, and cruel. And if you are reading some of the accounts of the pogroms from those cities, you wonder how a human being is capable of behaving like that. He's not a human anymore, he is a beast. That's how graphic, how horrible those events were. Anyway, this is the time when the Jewish communities start to form those units and organizations that are to self-defense against the local populations and even the Russian Empire. This is the time when prominent Jewish leaders emerged. We have people like Vladimir Jabotinsky, who created the self-defense units and also a Jewish legion. You have people like Joseph Trumpeldor, who became the first Jewish person to be an officer in the Russian army. He showed great bravery against the war with Japan, losing even his hand. Then he used those skills to help the Jewish people. Or you have people like Pinchas Rutenberg, who was a brilliant engineer, and he used those skills to help self-defense. Those are just a few that I could mention, but all those people were born in the Russian Empire. Because of the persecution of the time, they started developing those self-defense units, but eventually they all moved to the Holy Land, which was then controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and helped the Jewish settlements to defend themselves against the Arab bandits. And the leaders were followed by Jewish communities that basically left the Russian Empire. There was no place for them anymore in the Russian Empire because of the pogroms, and many of them decided to move. That was really one of the first aliyahs from a very long time that impacted the Holy Land, the future Israel, the state of Israel. And before I continue, I would like to show you how even sometimes really famous people show that they don't understand the situation. This is a short clip from Roger Walters' YouTube channel. You can watch the whole thing, but listen to this part carefully.
One thing is clear, when this is all over, Israel is going to have to apologize, not just to the Palestinians, but to the whole of the rest of the world. Say we're very sorry, we got it all completely wrong, and we are now leaving. Okay, we'll go back to Eastern Europe or the United States or wherever we came from, and leave these people, the Palestinian people whose land this is.
So Roger is basically saying that the Jewish people should return to Eastern Europe or America, wherever they came from. And this is not recognizing that the Jewish people escaped those territories from genocide. That's why they escaped. And that's the whole reason why Israel was created, so that the Jewish people would have their own state where they could defend against the aggressors. Jewish people were killed wherever they lived, and anti-Semitism was everywhere, and today it is frankly growing. It was not an evil plan to start oppressing the Arabs that lived in the Holy Land. No, it was created so that the Jewish people could have a state that would defend them. And this is exactly what Israel is doing. And you know, Roger later on in his video says, well, some of you may stay if you want, but Israel needs to be finished, but this new state needs to be created where everybody will be free, there will be democracy, and it's going to be great. Wonderful. I just have one question. Where in the Middle East, in the Near East, you have democracy? Well, guess what? The only country where in the Middle East and in the Near East you have democracy is Israel, where Arabs and Jews live together. Here you can see an index of the Near and Middle East, where it shows how much democracy you have in each country. And really, Israel is where you have the most democracy in those countries. So, believing that when Israel will be gone, it will be wonderful, well, the neighborhood doesn't show it. And I can tell you what would happen if Israel would be gone. Hamas would take over, it would enslave the people, and the country, whatever it would be called, would be really radical. Women would have to wear all those things on their faces and stuff. There would be no democracy. Nothing. Because that's the reality of the Near East. Okay, but let's continue our story. So, after World War I, as I mentioned in my previous videos, this territory was controlled by France and Great Britain. And the British started dividing this territory according to the deals they made with the Arab people and the French. And so Transjordan was created, today's Jordan, and they called the Holy Land Palestine. Now, I will not talk now about why the British called this territory Palestine. It's a very complex topic and I will leave it for another episode. Anyway, the demographics of this territory were changing rapidly, and you had much more territories that were now owned by the Jewish people. And the population was growing too. In the 1940s, you already had over 500,000 Jews living in Eretz Israel. Now, what is important to remember is that this land was bought by the Jews from the Arabs. And very often, those were territories that Arabs didn't even want. Now, as the Jews gained more and more land, which they purchased, the Arab leaders forbade their fellow Arabs to sell the land to the Jewish people. But there was one Arab family that was not Muslim but Christian, and they owned a lot of the land. And guess what? They sold it to the Jewish people. All this land you can see now in pink was sold to the Jewish people by the Sursuk family. And of course, you can read more about it on the internet if you are interested. But what is special about it is that because we have the documents, we can know exactly how much was paid for a particular land. And the Jewish people paid a lot of money for this land. So the Jewish people did not receive this land for free. They bought it for a very high price. And when they finally were able to settle, they were attacked by the Arab bandits. That's why I have this controversial title for this video. And of course, it is exaggerated. But if you don't understand the history, then you don't understand this conflict. And sometimes you're repeating things that make no sense if you study what actually happened. Okay, this is where I'm gonna end for today. We will follow up this topic. There is still a lot of things that we need to cover. I just scratched the base. And we're going to talk about, for example, the topography of Eretz Israel, of Israel, how some parts of this land are very nice, but others are just a desert. So it matters which part belongs to whom. I'm going to talk also about Israel's neighbors. So I'm going to talk about the long history that Israel had with Egypt, with Syria, Lebanon. Of course, in the ancient times, those territories were called by a different name. But we're going to talk about all of this and give a summary of the difficult relationship that Israel had with its neighbors. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, you like this video, hit that bell button. This really helps me. A lot of the maps, even the map you see now, I created myself. So once again, if you would like to support the channel, the best way to do it is on Patreon. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next episode. Shalom.